The Riven Disposition Changes for April 2020 with Titania Prime Access has been announced and the values presented. A few things to note about these values: DE has stated that, as a general rule, all new weapons will start at a disposition of 1. Unless the base variant is already below 1, in which case it'll take the base value. For instance, the Pangolin Sword has a disposition of 1.47, so the Pangolin Prime will be starting at 1. However, the Corinth already had a disposition of 0.95, so the Corinth Prime will also start at 0.95. As a general rule, weapon dispositions with a certain family are still adjusted partially in relation to one another. Otherwise, most base weapons would skyrocket to 1.5, and they'd have a very strange meta. In the past, we stated that shotguns relying on Rivens to reach 100% status chance like the Com and Detron would have dispositions locked, as a small decrease could cause a major loss in power. Since status chance on shotguns receive systemic changes in Warframe Revised, the previously stated restrictions on these Rivens no longer apply. Other than that, they stated they're still following the same rules they always have. Numbers are determined using a combination of player usage statistics and an internal power ranking that they maintain. They will also never change any disposition by more than 0.2, aka 1 pip at a time. So these are the values and what's happening. The Asteltra's disposition went from 0.8 to 0.7. The Astilla was 1.1 and is now 1.15. The Batacore 1 went to 1.05. The Baza went from 1 to 1.05. The Baza Prime went from 1 to 0.95. The Boar went from 1.4 to 1.45. The Boltor went from 1.2 to 1.25. The Telos Boltor went from 1.1 to 1.15. The Boltor Prime went from 1.1 to 1.15. The Bratton went from 1.3 to 1.35. The Mark I Bratton went from 1.3 to 1.35. The Bratton Vandal went from 1.25 to 1.3. The Bratton Prime went from 1.2 to 1.25. The Burston went from 1.4 to 1.45, the Burston Prime went from 1.3 to 1.35, the Sonos Prime went from 1.25 to 1.3, the Rakta Sonos went from 1.2 to 1.25, and the Sonos Prime went from 1.2 to 1.25. The Dera went from 1.35 up to 1.4, the Dera Vandal went from 1.3 to 1.35, the Dracoon went from 1.48 down to 1.4, the Kuva Dracoon went from 1 to 1.05, the Fullman went from 0.65 to 0.6, the Gricada went from 1.3 up to 1.35, Prisma Gricada went from 1.25 up to 1.3, the Javalock went from 1.25 to 1.3, the Heck 1.1 to 1.15, the Vacor Heck went from 1 to 1.05. The Com went down from 1.4 to 1.3. The Kuva Com went from 1 to 0.85. The Kuva Brahma went from 1 to 0.8. The Kuva Chakra went from 1 to 0.85. The Mida went from 1.55 to 1.5. The Mutilus Quanta went from 1.55 to 1.5. The Kuva Ogress went from 1 to 0.9, the Optical went from 1.05 to 1.1, the Paris went from 1.35 to 1.4, the Mark I Paris was 1.4 and is now 1.45, the Paris Prime went from 1.3 to 1.35, the Phantasma went from 1 to 1.05. The Ribico Prime went from 0.65 to 0.6, the Shadow went from 1 to 0.9, the Soma went from 1 to 1.05, the Soma Prime went from 0.95 to 1, the Stradivar went from 1.05 to 1.1, the Supra 0.9 to 1, Super Vandal 0.85 to 0.9, the Sybaris went from 1.2 to 1.25, the Dex Sybaris went from 1.15 to 1.2, and the Sybaris Prime went from 1.1 to 1.15. The Tiburon Prime went from 0.9 to 0.95, the Tigris went from 1.65 to 1.85, Sancti Tigris 0.6 to 0.75, and the Tigris Prime from 0.55 to 0.7. The Kuvatoncore went from 1 to 0.95, the Vectus 0.95 to 1, and the Velt 1.25 to 1.3. Those were the primary disposition values. For secondary weapons, the Akbolto 0.95 to 1.05, Telos Akbolto 0.9 to 1, the Akbolto Prime 0.85 to 0.95, The Aklex 0.9 to 0.95. The Axamati Prime went from 1 to 0.95. The Axstiletto 0.6 to 0.65. The Arca Cisco 0.05 to 1.1. The Atomos 0.8 to 0.85, Ballistica 1.2 to 1.25, Rakta Ballistica 1.15 to 1.2, and Ballistica Prime 1.15 to 1.2. The Akuva Brock went from 1 down to 0.9, the Bronco went from 1.4 up to 1.45, the Bronco Prime went from 1.35 to 1.4, the Detron 1.1 to 1.15, Gammacore 1.05 to 1.1, Hekau went from 1.2 up to 1.25, Hekau Prime went from 1.15 to 1.2. The Kuva Twin Stubbers went from 1 down to 0.9, the Lex 1.15 to 1.2, Lex Prime 1.1 to 1.15, Marelock 1.05 to 1.1, the Vacor Marelock went from 1 up to 1.05, the Kuva Nucor went from 1 down to 0.8, the Quats went from 1 to 1.1, Kuva Seer 1 down to 0.95, Sonicor 1.05 to 1.1, the Spira 1.2 to 1.25, and the Spira Prime went from 1.15 to 1.2. The Viper 1.4 to 1.45, the Viper Wraith 1.35 to 1.4, and lastly for the secondary weapons, the Zukti went from 1.2 to 1.25. Now, this Titania Prime Riven Disposition Changes, that being April 2020, brings the first time that melee Riven Disposition values will be changing, so they follow. The Aken Brunt went from 0.9 to 1.1, the Archititron went from 1 to 1.1, the Atarax 0.5 to 0.7, the Balor went from 1 to 0.9, the Bow 1.29 to 1.35, Mark 1 Bow 1.29 to 1.4, Bolt Ace 1 to 1.15, the Broken Scepter went from 1.19 to 1.3, the Broken War 0.79 to 0.95, the Casa War 1 to 1.15, Cobra and Crane went from 1 to 1.15, the Syath went from 1 down to 0.9, the Dakra Prime went from 1.15 to 1.1, Dark Dagger 1.52 to 0.7, the Rakta Dark Dagger went from 0.52 to 0.6. The Detat went from 1 to 1.1, the Destrezza went from 1.14 to 1.25, the Dex Dakra went from 1.15 to 1.25, the Dokrom went from 1 to 0.85, the Dragon Nakana 1.35 to 1.25, the Dual Cleavers 1 to 1.2, the Prisma Dual Cleavers 1 to 1.05, the Dual Kamas 0.81 to 1, Dual Kamas Prime 0.81 to 0.95, the Dual Carries went from 1.48 to 1.35, the Endura 1 to 1.2, Falcor 1 to 1.15, Fang Prime 1.36 to 1.3, the Fragor 0.96 to 1.1, Galatine 0.5 to 0.7, Galatine Prime 0.5 to 0.55, Galvacord 1 to 1.15, Gazelle Machete 1.35 to 1.4, Glaive 1.22 to 1.3. The Grand Prime went from 1.44 to 1.25, the Gunson 1 to 1.15, Hate 1.36 to 1.25, Heliocore 0.94 to 1.1, Cyanoid Heliocore 0.94 to 1.05, Harudo 0.5 to 0.7, the Jatkatag went from 0.75 to 0.95, the Jatkusar went from 0.81 to 0.95, the Jaw Sword's Riven Disposition went from 1.47 to 1.4, the Karist 1.29 to 1.35, the Kasheg 1.24 to 1.3, the Kogaki Prime went from 1.46 to 1.4, the Karudu 1 to 1.15, the Kreska went from 1 to 1.15, Kraker 1.22 to 1.3, Cronin Prime 1.43 to 1.25, the Crunch went from 1 to 1.15, Kuva Shield Egg went from 1 to 0.85, Lecter 0.5 to 0.7, Secura Lecter 0.5 to 0.65, Legion 0.5 to 0.55. The Machete Wraith went from 1.45 to 1.5. The Magister went from 1.09 to 1.25. Sancti Magister went from 1.09 to 1.15. Massateer went from 1 to 1.05. Mi1 went from 1 to 1.05. Mios 0.95 to 1.1. Maya 1.43 to 1.35. The Nami Skylar went from 1.175 to 1.3. The Nami Skylar Prime went from 1.175 to 1.1. The Nakana went from 0.5 to 0.7. Nakondi Prime went from 1.41 to 1.25. Obex 1.1 to 1.25. The Oma 1 to 1.1. Uthla went from 1 to 1.1. Orthos 0.5 to 0.7. Orthos Prime 0.5 to 0.55. The Orvius 1.15 to 1.25. Paresthesis 1 to 0.85. Pathicist 1 to 1.15, the Pennant 1 to 0.9, Plague Kiwa 1 to 0.85, Plague Kripath 1 to 0.8, the Prova 1.29 to 1.4, Prova Vandal 1.29 to 1.35, the Pupicist or Pupicist went from 1 to 1.15, Rab V went from 1 to 1.15, the Reaper Prime went from 1.29 to 1.15, the Redeemer Prime went from 1.17 to 1, the Sindo went from 1 to 1.2, and the Sindo Prime went from 1 to 1.15. The Setfan went from 1 to 0.9, the Sheev 1.25 to 1.3, Silver and Aegis 1 to 1.1, Skarner 1.22 to 1.3. Prisma Skarner went from 1.22 to 1.15, Skarner Prime went from 1.22 to 1.15, Skiajati went from 1 to 0.9, Sidon went from 0.84 to 1, Bakor Sidon 0.84 to 0.95, the Tatsu went from 1 to 0.95, Teko Prime went from 1.4 to 1.35, Thibodeau Prime went from 1.31 to 1.25, Twin Basalk 1.18 to 1.25, the Twin Krokor went from 1.48 to 1.35, the Vanka went from 0.5 to 0.7, Vanka Prime went from 0.5 to 0.65, the Volnus 1.2 to 1.3, the War went from 0.5 to 0.7, Wolf Sledge went from 0.96 to 1.1, and the Xenostar went from 0.5 to 0.7. So those were the April 2020 Riven Disposition changes that came with Titania Prime Access about a week after launch. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Bye.